Welcome to the Talent Revolution, Tales from the Trenches. I'm Joe Shambaum, along with my co-host Jill Caniglio-Kirk, and today we want to talk about the fun world of interviewing.
You ever think of this next piece within HR and TA? Think about it's like almost like dating, right? Think about interviewing, and it's really like dating if you really, really think about it, especially from the TA side of things. Think of it this way: you're out there messaging, calling, texting, social media, and you're trying to, basically trying to meet somebody, and especially on the proactive side, you're going out there trying to, I don't want to say coerce, but engage and attract somebody into a conversation with you. So you have some conversations, you start going back and forth in the dialogue, then you actually go on a date in a sense. You have a conversation, you're having whether it's a Teams invite like this or just a phone conversation and really getting to know each other. And then it's like, hey, should I really, I think we've got to meet, right? And then, meet the parents. And then it's like, well, then, you know what? Maybe it's, well, let's bring in so that's the hiring manager. And then you bring in, well, you know what? Maybe we need to meet my sister or brother. So you bring in another person from the team and they get to meet more of the family members. Then you progress even further. And you know what? I think they need to meet the grandparents. So then, therefore, it's the manager above or the VP. It really starts to think about like you're dating, at least from the TA side, because we're all really just, trying to get to know each other. Do we, does this engage? Do you want to come into our family inside of this company? Do you fit the culture? Do you fit the background? And do we want to make a long-term commitment together? So I know I went on a little bit of a rant there, Jill, but what are your thoughts on my whole analogy of interviewing and dating?
Well, honestly, I've never thought of it in that likeness, and I will admit that I'm not an expert on dating.
Neither am I,
At
believe me.
least it's been a minute for me. But truthfully, when I actually think about it, you're absolutely right in the sense of we have to kind of get uncomfortable first and have a little vulnerability with one another and kind of build up that trust like you would in a relationship until you kind of want to move on to that next phase and kind of get deeper in, right? And kind of open those windows to other aspects of your life and who you are, right? So I honestly love the analogy, Joe, and think it's really spot on from the perspective of the process you go through. And I think
And
one of the tricks for me is really how do you represent, kind of both sides of that from the candidate side and the other person's side to make sure that it's kind of a real world experience. That's a tricky thing to navigate because we are in a simulated situation where we're putting a person in a position to see how would they perform in this organization, how would they fit, how would they assimilate, right? And what would they
exactly.
bring? So, like I
And that's
said,
all the
I
different
love the
aspects of the
analogy.
interviewing, right? So,
Right.
especially as you go up in leadership levels, right, you're getting them into different experiences and different situations. You might go for a drink or a cocktail or take them to dinner or you go for a breakfast meeting, right? You're getting them and you're him or her them into these different situations to be able to really truly learn who they are and how they act and how they're going to behave in these different situations to see are they going to fit the family, right? And when we're talking to candidates, we're talking about culture is the family, right? Are you ready and able and fit exactly into our new family? And do you want to be part of it? And do we want you to be part of it? And of course, there's a technical and a professional background behind all of this, everyone. It's not this isn't dating in a sense, but you really are going through these different emotions and it's an emotional roller coaster. And really for the recruiting side, like we're building this relationship from the first, like we talked about in the candidate experience episode. It all starts with the branding and marketing and the communication as you go through it and then throughout the whole process. And when the candidate doesn't get selected, you got to break up, and it's heartbreaking at times because you've gone on this journey for weeks potentially depending on the length of your process, which we should get to later on, of course. But you're going through this and you're necessarily that person's really emotionally connected and invested in this process, and so are you, because usually you have hopefully a couple candidates going through the process and then you're doing this on multiple times. but you're really driving through that, and then you have to break up, and you might date them again in the future because they're pretty good, and that's part of the whole Rolodex of recruiting, and we can talk about that whole sourcing
Yeah.
and different things down the road.
Right.
But it's a really, and I'm sure there's other recruiters on that are listening in that are nodding their head going, you know what, Joe, it is, and I've thought of that way, but as you put it all there, it really is an aspect of that. So
Right. No, I think that's a fair point, and I can totally see this being a chapter in the future Joe Shambom stories book, for
oh
sure.
Lord.
Yeah. So, but if we
That, well,
honestly,
yeah, well, that's the offline
I'd
version.
like to kind of
Um,
frame it and dig it a little deeper. The analogy of dating, um, the goal of dating is really to kind of find the right fit, right? You kind of have to, it has to kind of be a win-win, fits together. And I think that really represents what's the goal of the interview process, right? At the end of the day, we're trying to find that perfect fit. And it has to work both from the organizational side and for the person side. So I'd like to kind of explore if you're willing to kind of dig in deeper to how do you do that and how do you build a strong process? What elements does your recruiting process really need to make sure that you kind of get to that end goal and that win-win and that perfect fit?
Well, and then you hit the perfect part. It's a process, but everyone's got to remember that the process is different for every company, every size company, and sometimes every role. So defining that really gets into that setup, that organizational in that strategy session you have when you're starting the recruiting process, right? So what's the recruiting process, but what's the interview process? So in that strategy, you're really deciding how many rounds, what do we need to categorize and understand that we're going to evaluate as we go through this process and set it up so it's consistent, meaningful, but also efficient as you go through this, because you can't have for a professional level role, 10 rounds of people, right? You shouldn't have 10 rounds at all. But, you want to be efficient in driving through this and strategic to be able to align to the principles of the company. So you're trying to assess that culture fit, but also that technical fit and who and what does what throughout the whole process. And that's what you're trying to define, in my opinion, on the strategy or intake session. So therefore it's clear, consistent. And then, but again, the concept will be similar for all the roles, but it's going to morph, right? Sometimes if it's a software role, for example, you might have some coding and different technical assessments. For a leadership role, there could be multiple different stakeholders that you need to have in part of this process. So it takes maybe a little bit longer. Or there's even assessments, whether it's written or a verbal or a culture assessment as you go through that process. But you define it, you move it through consistently and as efficient as possible.
Right. One aspect I would just also emphasize is that this has to be a joint decision with, the various parties and all the players in the organization that have a stake in it. Because while maybe TA has a certain view or HR has a certain view, we all kind of need to be on the same page as what is that right fit? What is the right duration of the process? What are the right steps in the process to be ready to make that decision? And I think that alignment is a critical piece. We all have a role to play in that, but it's really kind of that partnership of getting on the same page. And sometimes I know for myself, that's resulted in me maybe making some concessions because of practicality, because of time, because of money or resources, right? So I think every organization needs to really realize who are the stakeholders, how do we get the best process we can, realizing maybe it's not always perfect, right? And how do we steer toward, making that decision on the best fit for the company?
But that's also process improvement too, right? So you
Sure.
go through it, as long as you go through it consistently on that one role, you can then change it, right?
Right.
And definitely, there's a lot of times HR and the teams will come in with your competency and help competency plans for those different roles. And then the behavioral competencies that you're looking for in different types of pieces. Again, small or large.
Right.
That framework is typically there. And then the hiring leader. So you're right on the whole stakeholders. The hiring leader needs to have that be technical competencies that needs to be evaluated. And then what is that evaluation process? How do we be consistent and objective in those and to be able to drive through that? And then again, what does the recruiter need to do? What does the hiring leader need to do? And then if HR plays a piece into it, depending on the process that you set up. But all stakeholders have to be aligned and trying to drive through to again, we're all trying to, it's the same goal, right? How can we find the best person in the most efficient time that's going to add value and add to the organization?
Right. Another factor I would just say that you touched on that made me think of something else is really kind of that planning phase, and really the thought of really how do you ensure that there's no bias in your process? And one of the things you touched on was having a organized way of collecting feedback, be it a scoring sheet, right? Being a what attributes are we going to rate the candidate on? And I think that, it certainly has been something useful and pragmatic that I've done to both help, kind of calibrate at the end of the process, as well as, ensure we're all looking at the same things and applying the same weight and criticality to different elements that we're examining.
The bias is a big thing to think through, and there's lots of different potential biases that come into the whole process. Even just evaluating resumes for that pure example, right? And we could go into a whole nother episode talking about blind resumes and different aspects that way, because there's a bias potentially for the university or the school they went to or the prior companies or the different things, but also cultural biases, personal biases. But we need to be the best objective interviewers from all levels as best as possible, right? So there's always training, right? And I know there's a lot of free training and different other things that a lot of companies offer, but also you can get to be able to try to get that non-biased opinions, but it's that evaluation of it and, trying to drive through that. And that's part of everyone's responsibility to cut that bias out, right?
Yeah, and I think process lends to aiding in that. And another aspect is really how can you utilize different techniques or formats that also can help, kind of ensure that there's no bias. If we look at, the approach that an organization takes to interviewing, I personally feel like it represents and tells a story about who they are as a company. And, you've seen organizations who have this panel approach, right? And they have every candidate go through a panel and people are jointly having a conversation with the candidate. You have sometimes companies that go through some sequential process, or there's different gates in the process. Let's talk a little bit about that, maybe what your views on those things are. Do you agree that that kind of tells a story a little bit about the culture of the company? And, maybe we can go through a couple of pros and cons there.
Oh, 100%. I mean, your whole interview process gives a big light into the candidate's perspective of who am I meeting and the company and the culture that they're going through, right? Are the interviewers prepared for the questions and the role and to be part of that interview process, right? That shows a lot back to the candidate. Oh, they are welcoming, they are here, they understand what I'm looking for and what the role is, and trying to drive through that. There's lots of different interview styles. I think you have to pick what's going to be best that fits your culture and organization. The gate approach is probably the most typical that I've seen and been a part of, because it's like going to the next one to the next one. And that seems to be what happens a lot. I see a trend coming of a sequential, I call it sequential panel, where you're going to meet these three people or four, whatever that piece is, all in one day or within the next couple of days, for example, to be able to drive through it. And then they come back as a team and kind of get that group think together on, how did that go? What are their perspectives? But that's a lot of coordination. And then typically really coordination and organization of what are each of those panelists going to be evaluating and asking about. And I don't know if many companies are ready into that piece, because it does take a lot of extra planning and different process to be able to do that. I think it works better because then the candidate gets a better perspective instead of, oh, I passed this gate, then I go to the next one, I go to the next one, to be able to go through it when someone else might see something that someone else missed to be able to drive through.
Yeah, I personally would just say on both sides of the desk, the candidate both sees a good representation of how the team works together. And then I would just say from the company side of the desk, it's really about we're all hearing the same stories. We're all listening to the same examples. We're all kind of taking in exactly the same information, right? So that somehow kind of gives you a common platform to say we're all examining the same things. Very valid point. We all might be looking for different things. We might all have different questions to ask and have more expertise on how to assess what the candidate's saying, right? But I personally like the panel approach because of those elements. And I think it gives both the candidate and the organization, more to work with. But I also realize it's a huge investment of time and not practical necessarily as a starting point for a lot of companies.
I think the panel that's sequential, so the individual conversations, it may
Right.
take the candidate more time because you're having multiple interviews, which is an investment, but you can actually move faster. So if I was scheduling an interview for a
Hmm.
candidate with four different leaders, I can play with that, right? It's taking
Right.
a lot of the candidate's time, versus I got to get all four of these leaders or managers or whoever
Right.
technical experts together at the exact same time. That's harder and that's going to
Sure.
take longer. So I
Hmm.
think the individual, even though it takes more time on the candidate side, the individual conversations could actually make the process go a little bit faster.
Yeah,
And
that's
then,
that's real that's real world for sure. The
right,
other thing I would just say I've had work for me in the past when I've gone the panel approach is kind of having all the people and all the parties earmark like, hey, every
sure.
Wednesday
Yep.
from this time or once a month from this time, like keep it open. And if we cancel it, we cancel it, but we kind of try to have kind of have a lockdown time that if the organization is going through a lot of growth, I've just seen that work before, as well as the people get really familiar with one another if they're kind of in the same panels and they kind
Right.
of just start humming, right? And I find that, there's some value to that as well. But in the
Growth
interest
mode,
of
you're
team,
100% right. I
yeah.
mean, setting up that time, and then slotting in the candidates, and therefore it's just scheduled. 100%.
Mhm.
That works very efficiently when you're trying to go fast and you have the volume for it.
Right. Yeah.
So,
In the
Jill, I have a question for you on this because who does the behavioral questions? Because we all do behavioral interviewing, right, in
Sure.
the different pieces, and it's always part of a process. But from the HR side of it, who should be doing the behavioral interviewing side of the questions?
Well, I personally believe the development of the questions and kind of the thought and kind of analysis should be led by HR and talent acquisition, kind of in partnership. And then I really feel it's important that the leaders who are involved in the process also understand how to conduct behavioral interviews. While they may not be comfortable at first in like framing those questions, I think it's our job, as HR and talent acquisition professionals to kind of help build guides and tutorials and resources for our leaders to kind of make them comfortable with behavioral interviewing.
So
Um,
they're going to go into the interview, do the technical questions to be able to evaluate the candidate on, can they do this role that I'm looking for, and then ask the behavioral questions as well to be able to get that culture aspect. Is that what you're suggesting?
I think that's the best of all, scenarios where they can both explore the technical aspects of their aptitude, what they've done previously, but they also can put them in situations and kind of use behavioral techniques to see how they react, perhaps even to technical questions. I think that's kind of the aha, like that's when you've kind of really, really done something special when you involve the technical leadership in they feel comfortable with, the process, understanding behavioral, and then as they're taking information back from the candidate, they can kind of frame some behavioral questions that really real time kind of test their thought processes.
That's
Um,
what I like, right? To be able to combine your technical question to behavioral piece. Therefore, so for me, it saves time, right? But then
mhm.
you're getting that real world example of something to be able to get the candidate's perspective and really see how they're going to react and get those things combined together. It
Right.
Because I've been in some where, okay, now we're going to do the behavioral questions, and you go into this whole star method and you give them a whole definition, and
Kind of
it's
feels very
okay.
canned, very canned and
Yeah,
prescribed, right?
yeah, and then it's I mean it's already stressful enough because candidates go through this interview and they don't know exactly what they answer or all prepare on that, which I want to ask you about preparation in a second. And then it's like you're going from phases and they're really good at their technical piece because candidates, I mean, nobody knows this candidate better than themselves, right? And that's what I always
Right.
tell candidates, and relax and have a good conversation. And then it's all this behavioral piece, which, there've been practice and there's lots of guides and different things there. But I think that flow works better if you can kind of combine it. Therefore, it gets a good experience, and therefore, you're providing, like I said, a whole better experience. But also, instead of that canned gate phase of, okay, we're going to do this now versus this. So,
right. I think that gets the best results for sure.
So preparation, like, and I think this is a debatable conversation around how much do you prep a candidate for an interview?
Okay. Well, I personally take the approach that if I were on their side of the desk and I were on their side of the process, what would I want to know? So I personally feel like being honest up front with them about who they're going to meet, maybe a little bit flavor about their personality and their approach, what they can expect, helps put them at ease, helps kind of build up their confidence to kind of say, okay, I know what I'm walking into. I can do a little bit of preparation. And, I have a little bit of a window into what this might feel like. I just personally feel like that puts the candidate at ease, and we're going to get to a much better outcome if the candidate doesn't walk in scared and blind, right?
I'm with you because, you're sitting there on the candidate side and going, wait, what are they going to ask me? And you're trying to prep for all of these different scenarios because they're all going to be behavioral. Like, tell me about these sort of things. And if you know that it's this area or these things, and at least you're able to, not everyone's great thinking on their feet, because I'm sure many people walk out of that interview, oh man, I should have answered it this way, or I've got this better example. And you can always email and follow up to be able to showcase that. But it's your time to shine, right? Yeah, that's what I mean.
Driving home from the interview, which doesn't happen anymore because we're doing it on Zoom, right? But anyway.
Well, right, but it's that so that's where I say the prep. Obviously, you're not going to give them the answers, but if you can lead them down the path of this is the typical types of things that this person's going to ask, definitely about the personality, so they can be prepared for it, because you don't want those curveballs. But you can't lead the witness, as I want to call it, down the path, because that candidate still has to be true to themselves, because we want to make sure we're getting the right person to fit the role and the culture of the organization. So I think it's that happy medium of a good prep of, concepts and ideas. Therefore, they can prepare appropriately, in my mind, instead of just totally blind.
Right. Well, despite taking that approach and preparing the candidate, let's be real. We've all been in the situation where we throw out the behavioral question and the candidate is super vague and they're not really answering the question. And, you're sitting there going like, okay, now what? Right. And it's not what you've expected as the interviewer. Can you maybe share some of your techniques and tips on what you've done when that happens, when the person clearly isn't taking the right approach to try to get things on track?
So absolutely, because I've seen it many times, and I've seen some really good managers that interview this way, and they can see that the candidate's not answering it the way they know that they've probably had that experience. And I've done it. And this is also why I like sometimes sitting in on those interviews with the hiring leaders for twofold as the recruiter. And I'm sure most people listening as the recruiter go, I'd love to be able to sit in there, know what the manager's asking and how they're behaving. Again, a lot of time invested, but you're then able to, because we know the candidate even more from the phone screens and the conversations, you're able to pull, well, wait a minute, what about this, right? And I've done that, going, share more about this experience, because you can read the room and see that the candidate's not holding the manager's interest or not getting to that point. And then some really good managers will tell me more about this. What about this experience? Or be a little bit more specific. So it takes a good person that's experienced to kind of read that room and be able to pull that out of it. But it's continually asking those follow-up questions instead of being very 50,000 foot level, right? And that's the hard part. And that's why I always tell every candidate, give a good high level piece of it and then ask, do you want me to dive deeper into any aspect? And then therefore that's leading the interviewer or letting the interviewer dive where they want to be able to go more specific, because where you go may not be what's of interest to them. And that's how I suggest it. And if you can help, again, a recruiter won't submit somebody that doesn't feel that they're fit for the role. So it's how do you help highlight that and drive that?
Neither will an HR professional, Joe. Neither will an HR professional.
I would hope not. No. We don't want to waste anybody's time, right, on those things.
Right.
But what
Yeah,
other pitfall? I
I
mean,
like helping the candidate
yeah,
because truthfully, I think too many organizations take the approach that we've got these canned questions and answers, and if this person doesn't nail it, on to the next one. But when we've already invested the time, like satisfying that they do have this technical knowledge and know-how, and we believe they can solve our company's problems and that they've got the right, the right stuff. I'm a believer as well. Like we want to help them succeed in the process, right? And not everybody's great at answering questions like this, especially technical people. They're not comfortable in this situation. So I feel the same. If we can help facilitate a constructive dialogue that gets to understand them better and what they're capable of, that's the goal of behavioral interviewing. It's not to like put you on the spot and trick you and make you feel
a beat down,
small,
drag
right?
out
That's
kind of
not what we're trying
situation.
to
Yeah.
do. So if anybody out there, listening to this feels that's the intention, it certainly isn't mine when I use some of these techniques. And I do think behavioral interviewing is important. I think it's got to be, a facet of the process, but not the entire process. And it does, kind of add value and dimension that I think is important. So,
What other red
I,
flags have you seen in interviews that you might want to call out for whether you're recruiting, HR, hiring leaders, any other pitfalls or red flags that you've seen that you want to call out?
well, I mean, sure, there's so many, like where to go, right? I would just say some of the red flags to me of a candidate would be that they aren't answering the question I'm asking them and they're answering something maybe that they've rehearsed, right? So, I think that's a case of nerves. That's a case of maybe over preparation. And, when that happens, I just feel like your best bet is to really call them out on that and saying, well, this is what I asked you. This is what you answered. And I just want to really get to know what you really think about this, right? And I think calling them out on the spot is kind of how I've coped with situations like that. Again, we've both invested time in this. Um, I always try to give people the benefit of the doubt. But when I see this, we've all heard the canned answer. We know somebody's
Right.
reading it from, either something they've memorized or a piece of paper.
Some
And that's
AI now.
Oh, or yeah, not even something from their brain. Very, very valid point, Joe. Somebody else's words. So I would just say that's one red flag, and that's how I've navigated that. I think another one that is one to consider is just how much are we leading the candidate, right? It's a slippery slope of like helping a candidate along in the process, but you really want to be guarded against we're not leading the candidate to certain, responses or answers or kind of trying
True.
to kind of tip our hand, right? And the truth is, like you said, it's a relationship. Sometimes as HR people and TA people, we are rooting for a candidate, right? We pick a horse. And, we've all been there. So I think, that's another red flag to be mindful about. At the end of the day, the leader in the organization is going to make that person succeed or, they're either going to fail or succeed. And the person they're going to spend the most time with is that leader. So I think another red flag is us kind of calling ourselves out on some of that, I don't know if you'd call it favoritism. I don't know what the right word is, but I know every person listening has been like, yeah, like I've had my heart broken. I picked a horse and they didn't get picked and I knew they would have been better. But, I think being consciously aware of that helps you not, introduce bias to the process or, set that candidate up in a way that's either positive or negative. I think we have a responsibility to make sure that, we're operating with integrity. And I certainly know I've called myself out on occasion saying, yeah, I don't want to cross a line with a candidate and be overly helpful. I need to kind
Right.
of be, I need to be fair and consistent with everyone. So that would just be another one that I personally have dealt with.
And on my side, I've tried to dig into the engagement, right? So whether I've poked the bear and got the person interested or they've applied, are they engaged in the process? Are they engaged in the conversations? Are they asking
Mm-hmm.
questions? Right.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, are they going to be the right inquisitory person that's trying to ensure that this is the
Yeah,
right fit for them instead of just another job? Right. Because
right,
I don't want to fill this position again, right? For
right.
until the person got promoted in my
Yeah.
mind, right? So
So like
can
their motivation, right? How much do they really want this and all those things? Right.
Yeah, we got to be careful and watch that, right? And unfortunately, I've had to pull in and kind of shy away from that can and go, listen, I don't think this person's the right fit. They're not that engaged, and that's happened to be able to
Hmm.
ensure that we find the right person. Because again, I don't want to go do this again if I don't have to.
Right.
I know we touched on AI just a second ago, and I don't want to go too much into AI because I think that's a whole nother topic, and I think out there everywhere. But I think everyone and people on the phone or the listening in, I should say, are probably saying the same thing. I think AI is a part of the process nowadays, right? As long as you're being consistent, and it helps speed up the different sides of things. And there's definitely some AI tools to help with the videoing to make sure it's the right person and proctoring if you're doing assessments in different avenues. I think you have to decide the AI aspect you want to use inside of your process and then go forward. But I think it should be part of it. You just have to decide how that fits and what works best for your organization. And then we can dive into it another world. But I don't know, Jill, if you
Yeah.
want to comment on that
Yeah,
or
I
where
would
do you
just
feel?
say, very quickly, ways that I've leveraged it is really helping me kind of optimize my questions, frame my behavioral approach, things like that. Being able to dump the job description in, some cultural things about the company, and really try to kind of build some things, not starting from the clean sheet of paper, right, and getting that jump start. But I just want to emphasize it's really important that that's a place you start, but it still really needs that human touch. It still needs that personal review. And, I think that as long as you're using it to kind of move quickly and kind of get things started, it's great. But I think if you're relying on it solely without, really kind of investing some time too, that's a slippery slope in and of itself. But like you said, I know there's lots of more things we can discuss on that. But that's at least some of how I've used AI to kind of improve my process and just try to move a little bit quicker and work a little smarter. So,
I'd just say just be consistent, right? And that's the other side. And we'll leave the AI to another world of things. But what about the
right.
future of interviewing? I mean, what do you think that looks like?
I am a little afraid, I'll be honest, because I see currently companies testing things where, as an applicant, you're actually asked to record an interview, right?
I've seen that.
And I'm just, I'm not sure that that's something I buy into. Number one, if I were the candidate saying, why should I do this? Right? Why should I invest this amount of time when I'm not even sure I want to be there? I don't really have enough information, right? So I have no idea where it's going to go, but to me, like that's a lot to ask of a candidate. And I really, I can see the value of a video recorded message versus a resume, like kind of clicking. I, it's, I don't know. I could see a little bit of it, but like I said, I think that's too much as far as how you start the process. And like I said, I don't know. I'm a little bit afraid. Like anything, I think we're going to go too far in one direction and then have to do a course correction, right?
I
So,
think nothing replaces the face to face. Video is great, and there's a lot of remote jobs and a lot of remote interviewing, and I think that is a piece of the new process.
oh, sure.
Because it's great, especially for phone screening. I get to meet the candidate. We get to, again, build that relationship. But shaking the person's hands, looking across the table from them, seeing how they interact, even if it's a remote jobs, I still don't see that it replaces that fully. You can get a really
Uh,
great perspective because I've built teams and I've interviewed tons of times candidates and hiring folks, and then also for my own self before through this, right? Teams and Zoom and all these different avenues. But I think it'll continue to evolve. And I know there's a lot of technology that's coming along with it, and we'll see where it goes. But I agree with you. It's got to be that investment up front. I don't know that's a lot for a candidate to ask, like you said, without even really knowing all the details besides looking at a job description and a website.
Yeah, not to
So,
mention, like, where is that going? Who's doing what with
right.
it,
Or
right?
the
How are
data side,
companies
absolutely.
even
Yep.
investing time in reviewing all those,
Right.
right? And then you kind of talk about bias, and, we could obviously make certain assumptions about age and other, other things that are protected. So,
Correct.
yeah,
Well,
I'm
yeah,
with you.
and then the world is different too, right? Then are you doing it consistently by region and location and different
Sure.
laws? There's a lot you can dive and unpack in that world of things for sure.
Right. Right.
I think the other side of it, and we touched on it in another episode, is the experience, right? And I think, from my perspective, it's got to be a consistent, clean experience, right? You want to be able to
Yeah, and you're
be
talking about the candidate, just to
the
clarify.
candidate experience
Yeah,
for the interview.
right.
Yeah. But it's the experience for the hiring leader, right? Can we provide them a good experience that we're going to help them move through the process and get a good hire and be consistent, but also the candidate side. And we've touched on that, so we don't have to go too deep into it, but it's important. It's needs to be transparent and fair and consistent, and,
Yeah.
and keep in mind,
The
is
key
it the way
word
you
to
want to be
me,
treated?
yeah, the key word there is communication, 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 right? All around, inside the organization, to the candidate, right? I think if you do well in regard to communication, that's the number one thing you can do to ensure a positive experience for the candidate and for the organization.
Absolutely. I know we're coming up to time here, Jill, and I've been trying to ponder my own. I don't know if you have a story first or I can go first. I mean, interviewing, interviewer, interviewee. I've been through a lot of different aspects of this in my career in different situations, and I've drilled into some folks to have some fun and try to drive that, which may or may not be right or wrong, but trying to see how they react, especially under
Yeah,
pressure.
kind of like more of that
Um,
pressure situation interviewing
Yep.
technique, right?
But the one I want to bring up is interesting, is from the start of my career, and it really gets down to trying to learn and understand your candidate. And it was a big curveball for me and the person that I was interviewing with. And but it was about learning about the candidate. And we were interviewing this person, and it was for a software role. And you could tell they were a little awkward in the conversation and trying to get to know them and loosen them up.
Software and awkward go hand in hand, Joe. Come on.
I understand.
Sorry to all my friends out there that are totally cool that are software people, because you do exist.
That was
but...
Jill. That was Jill, not Joe. But and so we're trying to gain a perspective of the person, right? Lighten up the mood. And so the question was, well, what else? Is there any other things you want to ask or share about your person, your background, and other things? And like, what do you like to do for fun, kind of aspect of it? And it came out of left field, and the person was like, "I'm a blacksmith." I'm like, "What? You're a blacksmith?" Like, I'm like, "Are you serious? Like with an anvil and a fire and be able to make tools and different pieces?" And he started diving into some other aspects of things, and it ended up being about a game, right? This online game that was their character and that kind of things. But from the interviewee side of things, I was like, who am I dealing with? Like, what is this? And it was a curveball for us because the person I was interviewing with had no clue what this game was, right? But it's just a funny story, and it still resonates with me like 20 years later on, wow, like you could get any questions from anywhere and be able to, have to navigate that kind of situation, right? And going from that extreme to another extreme, and I know every recruiter has gone through this. There was a situation where I had to book travel for somebody and organize this whole interview within a couple days, and then the travel falls through and the candidate has to be there, and you're trying to book things and trying to navigate stuff, and then interviewers. It was kind of like this, if anything's going to go wrong, it kind of went wrong in this situation. But we all navigate, we pivoted, we moved, and I made the experience right to the interview to be able to showcase it, get the person there. They interviewed with a variety of different individuals, got the tour, added other pieces into it. The person actually accepted and came on board, which was awesome. But it was that it's not about interview questions and not about interview things, but it's that whole interview experience side of things to be able to pivot, navigate, and just drive through that situation. Right? Yeah, it happens.
Bring it home.
It was different things that way. And I'm sure there's other stories, but go ahead, Jill. What kind of fun world do you want to share?
Well, I actually have one I'd like to share from the opposite side of the desk, right? And it wasn't me. So if you're trying to figure out if it was me and what company it wasn't. But I have a colleague who, I'm close with. We collaborate professionally. And this person was interviewing with a local company for a pretty big high-level job. But it was a startup. It was a smaller business getting started, but with huge potential. So as they're going through the steps of the process, they kind of keep thinking of, new things that they want to introduce in the process. And ultimately, they were asked to do a business plan and like an HR strategy for this
Hmm.
company. So if you can imagine as an HR professional having like 2 hours of time interacting with a company, then saying, oh, please put together a strategy for me. Anyone with any experience would say, like, based on what? There's limited information out on the internet about you. I've spent 2 hours with you. Putting a full strategy together is a process, not like, an hour-long project, right? So in any case, this person was like, hey, I'm not going to like let it beat me down. I'm going to take the assignment on. I'm going to do the best I can, all these other things. So in any case, they go through this process of putting together this plan, and they collaborate with other people. I was part of collaboration with them on it. That's why I know about this story. And, I think an increasing number of companies are doing this to candidates and say, hey, we have a project for you to do,
Yep,
right? And we
they
want to
do.
see how you do with it. Number one, this one, I was like, maybe you should have asked some follow-up questions as to like what end goal is there and like had an opportunity to kind of interface with more people so you can really kind of do a good job on it. But the part of it that's the most shocking to me is the candidate showed up to deliver this presentation to who they thought was going to be the CEO and like one or two other C-suite people. They get on this Zoom call. There are 20 people there.
Oh no.
Like it was almost like an all-employee meeting. And they are presenting this. And no one warned them that there would be 20 people on the call. And furthermore, like there were working level people. We're talking like engineers and technicians and people that really had no business sitting in on a meeting like this.
Wow.
So, when I talked to this person, I was like, oh my God, like, what did you do? They're like, well, I had no choice but to really go through my pitch and go through my slides and walk through it. But the most shocking part is the person who was the CEO was actually walking around, not even on camera. You could hear the wind. They're like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm on a business trip, right? Um, and then ultimately, like I said, this pivot to having all these surprise guests on was just like a shock to them. And then I would just say, lastly, the kicker for me, the one that really rattled me was the employees that were invited in were like given the opportunity to ask questions. And what they decided to do is take the opportunity to make the candidate like, in essence, I'm going to look smart in front of the CEO. So they were asking questions like, "Oh, can you tell me about the last book you read on HR strategy and what
Oh,
your takeaways were, right?" And stuff like that. So anyway, I don't want to get too far down the path, but please, folks, do not put people in situations like that. Um, Obviously the person didn't join the company. Sadly, the company ended up not really hiring anybody, but it's
oh,
just an interview gone wrong story. And it's
sure.
an example of saying, what are you thinking if this is part of your process? Asking people to do unrealistic things, putting them in a situation with people that have no basis over making a decision over them, right? And then I think the last piece of advice I would give to anyone is if I were ever asked to do something like that, I think there's a way to say no respectfully and still continue in the process, right? I think people should really be cautious and guarded about doing free consulting work for people as part of an interview process. And maybe that's an unpopular opinion. I think simulations are fine, right? There's lots of different techniques that are fine, but you're not going to do work product for a company. Um, I don't think you should be asked to do that and work on something that extensive, right? So there's,
That
like I
seems
said,
pretty
maybe I got a little
extensive
off
and
topic,
far.
but there's a lot of different things that one touches that I think sadly
Sure.
has become too common in today's world, and I think we've gone too far. So I'll leave it
Yeah,
there.
that kind of goes to my summary of it all is preparation and plan and consistency through the process on what you want to do for an interview, right? And it starts at the basis, like I said at the start, how do we want to design this and drive through the process in a most consistent, efficient way and plan and prepare that, right? So if you're going to do this panel as all who's going to say what and who's going to evaluate what and how and drive
Hmm.
through that in a good, consistent way. So therefore it's fair, efficient, and effective. And then, but you're able to maneuver for the different levels, the different types of roles, and to be able to really showcase the company in a great way as you're attracting the new talent to your company.
Yeah, and to your point, the whole word attraction and dating as part of the, I guess we'll go full circle on that, is saying like, hey, we like each other. We believe in one another, right?
Yep.
That's where the process really should end if it's done well. And we're both excited of starting this journey together, right? And starting this, this new chapter. So, like I said, kind of closing with those remarks as far as the dating analogy, Joe. I really believe that you kind of struck a chord with me at least, because in the end, both parties should be leaving the process saying, I'm excited about this future, right?
Absolutely. And the experience, even if they don't get selected, they still had a good time and they enjoyed the process and drive through that. So,
Right.
but thanks everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed and got a little bit of some tidbits of information and some fun stories throughout the whole process. We enjoyed having you with us. And until next time, this is Tales from the Trenches, and have a great day.
Take care. Bye-bye.